Okay, we are going to continue with our academic agenda, so we would like to invite the director of UPME, Cristian Jaramillo, who will talk about public policies and perspectives on the electrification of the economy in Colombia. He has an undergraduate in physics and mechanical engineer from Universidad de Los Andes and a master's and PhD degrees in economics at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He has more than 20 years of experience in the public and private sector, and he has worked as assistant director of our statistical national department and director of or the organizational direction of our tax authority in the energy sector. He has been a commissioner in the Regulatory Energy Commission, CREC, an executive director of that same entity. He has been a professor of economics at Universidad de los Andes. You have the floor, Mr. Jaramillo.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Muchas gracias a todos los asistentes. Muchas gracias a Acolgen por la invitación.
Okay, I want to thank all the attendees for your attendance. I've been asked to talk about the long-term outlook and which do we see for the long term regarding the energy transition for the sector. The presentation I have is a long-term exercise. It's until 2050, and I want to tell you how this fits with what we see in the middle term, the transmission and generation expansion plan, that's around 15 years. And at the end, I'm going to talk about Llano, about today. The question regarding energy transition is how are we going to supply from here to 250 the energy demand with less fossil fuels, with less carbon emissions, because we are working on a decarbonization exercise. But what this implies is with less fossils. Today, fossil account for 60% of the energy matrix. Energy demand is going to grow, so I need to reduce the consumptions that produce carbon emissions, and at the same time I satisfy a growing demand. As to the electricity sector, as we have stated in the strategies analyzed by the National Energy Plan, or PEN, there are some strategies related to increasing the participation of unconventional renewables in the generating sector. We should not waste energy in consumption, but there is something very specific, and it's the strategy of electrifying the end energy uses, and that is what we are going to cover. How can we crystallize that electrification, and which are the difficulties along the way? With that logic in mind, if you go to the National Energy Plan, this plan has different pillars. It's like I need to guarantee these things along the way. So the pillars are security, reliability, the mitigation and adaptation to climate change, which is the new ingredient that has been incorporated in recent years, competitiveness and economic development, which is for energy to be useful for the well-being and happiness of Colombians, and a pillar on knowledge and innovation, which is something that enables us to materialize the rest. It is the resource that is going to help us find the pathway. With those pillars in mind, and having a clear definition about electrification, which is to replace in existing processes energy consumption for electrical energy consumption, because I can think about electrification as coverage, as finding new uses to electricity, but no electrification to replace energy uses that are not with electricity and to do them with electricity. Along these lines, we have 4 objectives under the National Energy Plan, where electrification is going to be core in order to make sure that we comply with the already mentioned pillars. One is to have a low-emission energy system that is directly related to climate change, the adoption of new technologies for the efficient use of energy resources. There are things that can be done more efficiently if the energy being used is of electrical energy, and also digitalization and use of data in the energy sector. So electrification is key for many of the objectives that have to do with what we want to do in the long term and help us comply with the pillars under the National Energy Plan. On the left-hand side, we have CO2 emissions in the different scenarios foreseen by PEN or by the plan. The PEN doesn't say, okay, I'm going to choose this scenario. They explore different paths to take, which are the ingredients that must be included in those pathways, and to quantify this. How much is this going to cost? Which are the trade-offs here involved? Is not to choose this one. No, I mean, if you choose this one, you have to think about this or that. So the four pathways analyzed here, top down is, I mean, you have the ones that are more ambitious, less ambitious, and the less ambitious is disruption, and you have to see which is the one that bets on decreasing emissions. That is the most ambitious one, and it is costly regarding what needs to be done, but it shows the degree of ambition if one is thinking about climate change and the reduction of carbon emissions. When one goes to the chart to the right-hand side, all this implies an increase in energy demand, but the most ambitious imply a less increase in energy demand. So the idea is to gain in energy efficiency, and many elements that say, okay, I do not want to waste energy, I need to be smarter on how to use this energy. What we see here is that if I want to be more ambitious, I have to improve or optimize the energy use. Let's take a look at the charts in the bottom to the right-hand side. Here we're looking at electrification. The most ambitious scenarios have a participation of renewable, nuclear energy, or hydrogen as something that is like an aspiration. And if you take a look at the other chart, it's, I mean, fossils, they have a lower participation. So what we are seeing here is that in order to bet on the most ambitious targets, I need to be more efficient in energy consumption to consume less energy, which is the upper chart, and also substitute or replace the energy sources towards more renewable sources, and that is what the two charts below indicate. Okay, I'm going to zoom in this topic. Here you have the participation of electricity in the different scenarios of the National Energy Plan. Here you have 2019, then we have the update one, and then you have disruption to the right, which is the more ambitious one. Today, we have some technologies that could be put in place, some actions that we can adopt, which are viable from the technological standpoint, because this plan, I mean, considers this for 30 years. I mean, some things are just starting, but they are promising, and these are involved in long-term scenarios. But today, what can we do? Because it's technologically viable. We have electrification for cooking in the household sector, electrification of private light vehicles and passengers vehicles, a change in railroad transportation, and electrification of low-temperature commercial and industrial processes. As to the long-distance transportation, it is more difficult. It's, I mean, electricity, it's not like you can transport it in an easy way. Certain things are still not viable. For example, we are not speaking yet of electrical airplanes because the batteries are too heavy. Okay, the second point is, do we have a potential? Yes, we have solar potential distributed throughout the Colombian geography. And today, that potential has really created much interest. And the bullet in the middle is important, and that is that we have 8.9 gigawatts of solar projects with approved connection today, against 17 gigawatts, which are projects that are not there, but they do have connection approval. And we have other 11 gigawatts that are in waiting in the queue in order to get the connection. The figures are just huge. In principle, to have much interest is very good. However, there are certain problems. Like, why are we talking about 8.9 plus 11? So we're talking about 20 additional gigawatts when what we have are 17 installed. The wind potential is there. It is concentrated on the Caribbean coast, and we have around 2.5 gigawatts with approved connection. So we can do it. And obviously, this is located in different places of the Colombian geography. How is this reflected? So now we are moving from 2050 to a closer date. And we have to see that we are moving in this direction already.
When you look at a 15-year down the road planning, which is what we look at in the transmission and generation plan that was under consultation recently, the exercise already reflects that we're moving in that direction and that results are going in that direction. These are plans where I have some assumptions. This is like the starting point. It's projects with certain commitments on the current portfolio, demand exercises, and some exercises on prices and costs to be able to estimate what will be the cost of energy at its own time. And we do analysis under different scenarios that could be there. And they give results, the necessary transmission expansion, and a probable generation mix that we could be expecting to have. And I'm saying probable mix because even though transmission can be planned from the center, at the end of the day, the expansion in generation is determined by the market, as the Colombian regulation says. So those are the different scenarios that come out of there. This is a very dense figure, so let's focus only on what would be the main messages. The first one is on the left, we see the scenarios, including whether the Hidroituango Dam will come in with 1,200 megawatts or the second phase on the right, with the amount that we see there for power. Scenario 5 and Scenario 6 correspond to what we could expect with El Niño phenomenon scenarios, the expansion that I would need for an El Niño scenario happening, which is not very different if I have 1,200 megawatts or 1,400 megawatts in Hidroituango, which is understandable because under an El Niño phenomenon scenario, the additional scenarios will give me more power, but not really more energy. So that's understandable. So why should we focus on this scenario? Because when the Commission for the Regulation of Energy and Gas, CREG, makes analysis for reliability in the system and decides to go for an auction for a reliability charge, these are aspects that are related to the topic of firm energy. So these 200 megawatts in Hidroituango will not really make that much of a difference for that type of expansion associated to reliability in the system. But there is a difference when you look at other scenarios that would not correspond to very dry periods. Of course, it makes a big difference because then the additional power availability with a certain amount of water, what you would need would be less. As for the rest, what we can see, and this is something to be expected, is that as we implement a CO2 tax, the installation needs will be higher. And if we apply the environmental flow rate restriction, that will reduce the flexibility of the hydro plants that we have in the system today. This is what we foresee in terms of expansion, and in all cases, the renewable energies are the leaders, are the ones that give the orders, solar and wind. Why? What are the considerations behind saying this? Let me go back. The point is this. The way the expansion plan is drawn today, especially the generation expansion plan, we ask ourselves, what is the market showing? We start from the basis of the projects that are already in the project registry saying, I'm interested. The ones that have asked for connection applications, and the ones that have it already. So the mix that we see there is just a reflection of the interest that the market is showing towards generation today. As to whether this will happen in that way, it remains to be seen. There are many approvals for solar and for wind, so you would tend to think that that's the way it'll go. Now, the generation mix will be determined by the market initiatives in the light of the different mechanisms for expansion that exist out there. It's not the case with transmission. Transmission responds to the central planner decision and the analysis that we do. So I'm going here to the determining factors, to the expansion from a central point. And this is different. On the left-hand side, you see a list of 7 elements that are part of the analysis, meeting demand, reliability, reduction of restrictions. These are typically the things that determine the expansion decision in a transmission expansion plan. When you have an auction for the reliability charge recently done, well, this is a determining factor for most projects. And the project that was consulted upon recently, meeting the demand and reliability were most important. The other factors were less important in the projects that were consulted. So this is what's typically done, and this is what is reflected in the plan that was consulted recently. So this is not what we think we will have to do for the next plan. And luckily, it'll happen by the end of this year or the beginning of the next year, and in general looking at the future. And here we have a decision that matches very well what we heard from the previous panel: stability in the rules of the game. Looking at the longer term, what we're thinking is that first and foremost we will have to anticipate more in the development of the civil works because they're taking longer than expected because of the reasons discussed in the previous panel. And it would be our negligence not to incorporate this in the expectations, at least when talking about the short term, to incorporate that in the term that the works will take. So we will be betting on transmission at a longer term. What does this mean in terms of expansion? It means that there's some doubt as to whether I'll be able to get generation projects, especially the smallest generation projects that we're seeing today, that will be willing to commit themselves to an 8-year horizon when the expansion will arrive. These are projects where their management and development will take 4 more years. Solar energy and wind energy, that can be done in 18 months, but it'll take 4 years in their management. But if I'm looking at an 8-year expansion, it's difficult for me to get the other party to say that they will be connecting to it on the other side. So we will have to be more anticipated to the interest of getting connected. We will have to make bets and decisions, thinking, okay, the transmission expansion will be a leader and will be sending signals as to where the generation matrix will be moving, because I'll be coming first with a line, or at least the line will be built before there's clarity as to who is going to be connecting on the other side. These bets have to follow some criteria. In fact, there's a discussion in the policymakers as to what those criteria will be. A simple way, not necessarily the best way to do it, is to say, I have solar potential in the east part, so let's grow to the east. That would be a way. But there's other ways to go in the world of decarbonization. For instance, I want to send signals of technological renewal in the matrix. That would imply different expansion needs. Or I want to send signals of flexibility, which is indispensable if I want to have more unconventional renewable sources. So that would imply a different type of expansion, perhaps with other grid grid elements. So these are all questions that we're posing to ourselves because we have to step into the world of making bets. The last time we did that was a very time-consuming, controversial process. I'm talking about the La Conectora line, and now we're realizing that it would have been best to start earlier because we were suffering precisely because of the delays in the management that we refer to. Let me make a pause here because I refer to the long-term view at the unit, and how we are looking at the midterm, 15 years. And the pause is because sometimes it's good to step back, but sometimes you have holes in the road right next to where you are, and we're making quite drastic decisions with a problem that we have with the connections. The almost 9,000 megawatts of approved connection that we have today and the 11,000 that are waiting to have the connection approved, what we see is that out of those 9,000, not all are moving towards materializing in projects. There are 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 that look like that generation is actually coming. But there are others where there's doubt. And we say this because there's this queue of 11,000 megawatts where there are very promising projects that are awaiting expansions when we have these 5,000 megawatts that perhaps will not materialize. So this is what the market says, covering or taking advantage of the capacities. So the government is already looking at the idea of transferring connections in the future according to the best use of the existing capacity or the capacity that will be installed. The expectation is that Craig will issue a final resolution in this respect, and we will be implementing this new way of allocating capacity and setting aside capacity during this year. This will be controversial and quite drastic, but it's a step forward that has to be taken, and I think that you all are keeping this in your own radar. Okay. So what's the conclusion of this story? We have a clear intent of moving towards decarbonization. We have an answer and a clear market initiative saying that they're definitely moving towards that point, and we have the potential to do it, and the market has reacted to that, and we have a big interest in installing solar and wind sources. So that's what we're seeing in the midterm. As to the long term, we will have to have technologies that are still at their very early stages, but that hopefully will be there by then. And we will have to make investments for the technological revamping. And there's a central message in that public policy have to provide certainty to investors. That's what we heard in the words of regulatory stability in the previous panel, because we're talking about very long horizons in time, so investors have to have that assurance. But there's a question that comes out at the end, a remaining question. It's a question that is important already today, talking about connections, which will be a controversial issue. It is important when looking at the midterm, because in a process like the one that we're experiencing, there will be decisions as to the bets, where the different actors in the system will have their own opinions, and it's important in the long term, because it's the long term. That's because it's very far away. Energy transition is a process that takes a long time. The definition of a 30-year down-the-road plan is just guessing, but we have to be certain of something, and it is that the plan will need changes down the road, and it will change because new opportunities will come up or because hurdles will come up, so it will necessarily have to change. And when in the previous panel they said we want regulatory stability, that is true. Instead, I would say that what they need to have is clear rules for the game, because rules, it's not only about stability, but about renegotiating that stability. The big challenge that awaits us now, as the way we see it, it's a challenge that overwhelms the energy sector, which is governance. How will we be able to maintain clear rules and generate stability whenever necessary, but also be able to renegotiate the pathway forward whenever it might be necessary? And that, we believe, is something that, the governance elements of an energy transition process is something that is still an issue that we have not addressed. I think that it's the most important challenge to get to the end of the road, whatever the end of the road may be. One of the scenarios in the National Electrification Plan, or anyone that may pop up along the road. So that's what I had for you regarding the view of the planning and mining unit in regarding the topic at hand. Thank you.